Today, we will just be presenting short summaries of the study given the time limitations. I will start off looking at the slope stability component. That will be followed by Dr. Farrick, who will speak a bit about the infiltration and runoff restoration aspect as it relates to vetiver. And then finally, Dr. Eudoxie will speak about the restoration of degraded soils using vetiver grass as an intervention. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I will start off immediately in the interest of time. And just to provide some context in terms of the vetiver plant itself, it is well established that this plant has a variety of different properties that allows it to serve as in different functions as a nature-based solution, if you would want to group it as that. And these are some of the functions that are already noted as factors or as components of how this particular grass can integrate into nature-based solutions for a variety of problems. So the first thing is that it helps in terms of runoff, infiltration, and conductivity or hydraulic conductivity. It also plays a role in carbon sequestration and capture, climate resistance and resilience, soil health and quality, slope stabilization and erosion control, and soil and water remediation. For the purposes of what we will present today, we will more or less focus on the soil and water remediation, the slope stability, and the hydrology component with runoff and infiltration. So I'll get into the first study, which speaks about slope stability. We already know that we have issues throughout the region that relate to slopes that are not very stable, and with the triggering factors of tropical rainfall, many times subsequent to a rainfall event, you will have landslips and various forms of mass movements occurring. The traditional way of dealing with this is engineered interventions, which at times are very costly. And there's a school of thought that many engineered interventions are not entirely sustainable for a long term. So eventually a wall is going to fail. So the school of thought now is that we try to focus a bit more on nature-based solutions, such as using the vetiver grass, which has a variety of benefits apart from the slope stability, as you would see from my previous slide, as well as from my colleagues who will present later on. So this study, in terms of nature-based solutions, generally focused on looking at the slope stability component. Worldwide, nature-based solutions is becoming more and more popular as a form of green infrastructure for improving climate resilience. It has popular worldwide applications for climate change adaptation and mitigation. I heard from the previous presentation, in terms of the Green Climate Fund and all these different adaptation funds and so on. One of the key issues is that we have projects that are implementable and projects that could improve livelihoods as well. And when you look at vetiver grass and nature-based solutions in general, these are one of the ways that we could do that. And much of our issues in the Caribbean, while we want to mitigate and still maintain some level of resilience with respect to how much carbon we emit, our focus should really be on adaptation, because we recognize that despite whatever we may do from a mitigation perspective, it will be or have limited impact on a global basis when it relates to climate change and global warming. In terms of vetiver grass, it's a global example of using a nature-based solution or a vegetative plant that helps with slope stability. It has been used in many countries, and what we wanted to do from this study is to quantify that, to see how exactly does it work in our circumstances, because such studies have not been done in local conditions. So we established a site. It was a controlled study site at the Tucker Energy Services campus facility in South Oropuch. As you can see from the diagram there, it's a uniform slope of about 15 degrees. And each of these different plots in between these black mats are basically the treatment plots. prior to us installing any of the treatment. So you see it's a uniform site, all with the same soil type and same environmental conditions, such that we can say that whatever differences we found at the end would be as a result of the treatments that we would have placed in the respective sites. We install the nature-based solutions, and I will speak about what these solutions are before. Vetiver grass was one of them. We also installed coconut matting and natural vegetation hybrid coconut matting interventions. We installed some soil moisture and rainfall monitoring equipment. The soil moisture probes that you're seeing here in this part here, they can measure soil moisture at 5 depths. So it started at the surface, about 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 40, 60, 80, and 100. So you're getting a report basically on the moisture content at the various depths in the soil profile. We installed 3 of these probes in each plot to ensure consistency and to ensure scientific rigor of the data that you would be collecting. And it measured moisture content every hour for a period of around 3 months during the rainy season in 2021. We also did a soil characterization study to ensure that there was uniformity in the soil properties across all the plots. And that in summary is an overview of the research activities that took place. These here are the plots that we established. So we had the bare plot, which had no treatment, right? Bare soil. Then we had coconut matting, and then we had a plot with coconut matting and natural vegetation. And then we had a plot with natural vegetation alone, and then a plot with vetiver. And as you could see, they all this was at the initial stages of the project. So the vetiver grass became more established along the way, and these plots were more uniformly presented or uniformly represented later on in terms of how the grass would have the natural vegetation that was spread across it. In terms of the results now, you would see in this very, very detailed sets of graphs, we try to look at all the different treatments with soil moisture at different depths, right? And you're seeing that vetiver influence soil moisture the most, especially at the lower depths. So if you look here at the blue line, that's really the thing that we want to point out. The blue line is the vetiver grass, and you're seeing very, very clearly that in all cases, except for the initial depth where you have the coconut matting natural vegetation having a slightly lower moisture content for a couple of months, or a couple of weeks, sorry. In all other instances, vetiver grass served as the main regulator, in a sense, removing the most moisture from the soil, right? And that's the main point at all the different depths, from 20, 40, 60, and 100 as well. Now, before we can make any decisions from a scientific perspective, you have to assess that data statistically to see if there's any significance. What we would have seen before are visual trends. And when we looked at the data statistically, we found that in this red area that you're seeing at the bottom of the table here, that in a two-key comparison, the treatment versus depth showed that the vetiver treatment had the greatest significant, greatest difference, and it was significant in terms of its influence on soil moisture across all the depths. This was followed by, the coconut matting and natural vegetation. And both treatments showed the lowest moisture content means at the bare plot, the coconut matting, and the natural vegetation all presented higher means, as you could see from the table here, right? So this basically says that the natural vegetation, the coconut matting, the bare plots, all these different interventions had some effect, but the most notable effect was seen with vetiver grass. So the main conclusions from this study was that the bare soil lacks regulation. In most cases, throughout all the monitoring period, there was high soil moisture, means between, say, 95 and 85% in comparison to other treatments. The vetiver grass treatment had the greatest reduction in that there was a range of about 27 to 34% across 4 depths in terms of the percentage reduction, in terms of how much less moisture there was across the 20, 40, and 60 and 100 centimeter depths. The hybrid system, which consists of the coconut matting and natural vegetation, had the second largest reduction across 3 depths, 20, 40, and 60. Now, in terms of the way forward, soil moisture monitoring can be explored as a potentially early warning mechanism for landslips in hazard-prone areas. So once you have these probes and you're able to identify a threshold at which the soils can fail, which can be done, you will be able to assess or determine prior to a landslip or mass movement event that there is the potential for this to occur. We will also want to conduct some further analysis in the dry season for some comparison, because there is some concern that in some soils, vetiver grass can extract so much moisture that it could lead to sort of drought-like conditions. So that's something we want to verify and see what is happening. We also would want to upscale this study because we only utilize one soil type, and Trinidad has 123 different soil series. So if we want to get a more comprehensive understanding of the process, we may want to explore this same type of study on some additional soil types. And we'll also want to explore some other hybrid options with vetiver, for example, and other green and gray intervention. So that is the idea is that we want to explore going forward, and we can say without a doubt that at this point we are very certain that in terms of moisture regulation, vetiver grass is a main or a good regulator of soil moisture in terms of its ability to remove excessive moisture from soils. And how does this tie back to slope stability? Moisture is one of the triggering factors that leads to instability. So once we are able to reduce or remove the a certain amount of moisture from the soil, it limits the instability that could occur in the respective soils. So with that, I end my contribution to this presentation, and I pass over to my colleague, Dr. Farrick.
One of our projects was really aimed at trying to understand how the vetiver improves infiltration and reduces runoff on steep slopes in the Paramin area. So you would have seen through Nikolai's presentation some images and so on the Paramin area. And some of the motivation behind this was really that, during really heavy rainfall events, there would be large amounts of water that would run downhill, right, and then flow into the streets. And the runoff wouldn't only carry large amounts of water, but would carry large amounts of sediments as well. So part of this particular study, in addition to looking at how the vetiver itself would affect infiltration and thereby runoff generation, we also really aim to try to understand how it would affect erosion. So the site at Paramin is quite steep. I don't know how many people in our audience has looked at the Paramin site. So you can really get to see the extent of how steep the particular land area is. And you would see that there would be 2 hedgerows of vetiver that were planted earlier this year. So the aim is really to work along with farmers in this particular area and to come up with a nature-based solution in terms of, again, increasing infiltration, reducing runoff, and reducing erosion. And that's particularly important even for the farmers as, as they continue to lose soil from the site, they're essentially losing that medium for their own crops, having loss of nutrients, so it's going to cost them a bit more in terms of fertilizer additions and so on. And in terms of infiltration, higher infiltration rates, so in other words, how quickly the water moves through the soil, is also important for the farming community, but also affects a lot of people downslope of these particular sites. So what we designed in these in these very steep environments was a system of really capturing the runoff at the site. Now, it took us a little bit of time to really come up with these types of systems. We tested different designs. We tried plastic drums. We tried all sorts of different things because it's not very easy to work in those very steep slopes environments. So essentially what we came up with were using older steel barrels to develop these runoff plots. And the idea of the plots are essentially, we have a known area of land where we would have rainfall falling into these barrels, and the barrels are then connected to a PVC pipe, which drains into another pipe. And that pipe would actually, you don't see it here, but we have sensors in the field right now, which would estimate the height of water that's coming in. And we can use that to essentially determine how much runoff is occurring from these different plots. So what you would see in these plots would be sites where there's no vetiver, and we have sites where we have vetiver on the hill slope. So what we are essentially going to be doing is we will be comparing the runoff in each of these plots. And where we would see higher levels of runoff, that would essentially indicate that the infiltration rates are a lot lower and that we generally have higher runoff over the surface. A little animation here, right? So that's just animating how it's looking. We also have some erosion pins that we use to measure the rate of soil loss on some of these slopes. And erosion pins are quite simple devices. You can see here that they're essentially two pieces of, we have rebar that's installed in the soil, and we paint it, right, so that we can actually see it in the field. And these pins are installed across that entire hill slope. So behind vetiver, in front of vetiver, in places where we have crops, where we have no crops. And what we do is that we go out into the field every 2 weeks, and we measure the distance from the top of the pin down to the bottom of the pin. And that tells us how much soil is either lost or gained at each of these pins. Now you have to put quite a lot of pins so we get a nice distribution of values across the hill slope. And we have some data that has come back from it, and we've seen that we have lost soil in pins. So you can see from this particular image, we have pins that aren't around the vetiver, and we've had some substantial soil loss around some of these pins, where for the pins behind the vetiver especially, we do see the accumulation and buildup of soil. Now, we do know that this occurs based again on some of the evidence that we have, but it's really good to have very specific country-based evidence that we can apply in other locations in Trinidad and Tobago and also throughout the Caribbean, right? So again, things took us a little bit longer to get off the ground in this particular study. As I said, working in these steep environments are really challenging, and we had to really come up with some really innovative types of instruments and approaches to do the work in these environments. But the erosion does appear to be higher in the areas without vetiver, and again, the runoff also appears to be higher in the areas without vetiver. So moving forward, what we plan to do is continue monitoring right, throughout the next year, just so that we have some longer term data. As Nikolai would have also spoken about, to supplement some of the erosion studies and the runoff studies that we were doing, they would have built these living check dams in the hill slope. And we just have some dimensions of the particular check dam. And earlier this year, so Ronald, if you can go to the next slide, we did just a little bit of surveying of the check dams, just to illustrate the effectiveness of them. And I can attest to how effective they've been, because there were some sections where we were very hesitant about crossing the gullies, but we've really seen a good accumulation of soil, so much so that we can now walk across from one section of the hill slope to the other side quite comfortably. So the check dams are actually doing a really effective job in erosion control. And it's also important for water, because the water itself can be redistributed across the hill slope a lot more effectively as the gullies begin to accumulate sediment. So next slide. Right, so these are just some of the things that we plan on doing in the next year. Again, we really need these longer term type of studies just to provide and account for differences in climate, rainfall properties, and things like that. So hopefully by 2023, we should have a lot more data. We're also going to supplement what we have in terms of the runoff plots with other measurements, including looking at infiltration rates, using some small instrumentation, characterizing the soil properties, etc. So hopefully by 2023, we'll have a much more robust data set and a lot stronger conclusions regarding this particular study. So I want to move on now, right, to our second set of work that we're looking at. And this is really something quite interesting, where we're assessing whether or not how effective vetiver can be as a companion species for degraded land restoration. Now, there's a lot of anecdotal information about that exists out there on vetiver growing along other plant species, and these plant species doing a lot better than other trees or other plants that aren't grown next to the vetiver. So we were really interested in trying to understand and to test whether or not this is something that would be effective in a local context. So as part of the quarry regeneration study, what we were looking at was how does vetiver affect or work as a companion species. Now, in terms of a companion species, we were looking at it a bit more from a water hydrological perspective, but also incorporating some aspects of soil science in there. So if you have a look at the next slide, right? So essentially, again, we're going to assess the potential of vetiver as a companion species. And to do so, we're looking at it, like I said, from a hydrological perspective, but we're also on a soil perspective, and we're also looking at it from a microclimatological perspective. And that includes measuring things like air temperature, the humidity, soil temperature, and so on, to see how the vetiver actually influences those particular properties. Next year, we're going to assess some of the soil hydraulic properties to see how the plants actually alter it. And part of the work is also using isotopes as a tool to actually track how the plants use water. So what we hypothesize is actually that the vetiver can access deeper stores of water from deeper parts of the soil system. And as it pulls and uses that water, sapling or young tree species may be able to actually access that. So we're going to try and test that in the field, but we also have an ongoing lab experiment. So if you can move on, Ronald, to the next slide. And these are just some pictures. So one of our students out in the field highlighting so if you click for me. It would highlight our temperature probe and humidity probe, which is in the white, and some of our soil moisture probes in the upper site, which are in the blue. Next slide. So again, this is some of our preliminary data, and this is from the lower site. I didn't show as nicely as Ronald did all the different layers, but our 10-centimeter layer from the lower site, which is a lot sandier, it was quite interesting. So one of the things that we noticed was that, at least in the established sites during the dry period, we did see a lot higher soil moisture. So that's in the red line, like between March to April. But once we got into the wet season, we didn't really see much of a difference in the soil moisture or the response and the responsive rainfall events between an established vetiver row, right, a new vetiver row, and the control site, which has no vetiver. So if we can move on to the next one, please. So the upper site, so that's located at a higher topographic location, was also quite interesting. At the control, we actually saw very little response. It's a little bit noisy here. 2 rainfall inputs as compared to the lower site, but at least in the established row, we did see that it responded quite frequently to rainfall inputs. And this may be due to differences and changes in the soil structure as a result of the vetiver. Again, this is just some preliminary work, and we're going to look into this a bit further. Next slide. One of the interesting things that we did notice, so this is a image of the soil temperature at the lower site, 10 centimeters below the surface. And one of the things that we did notice was that, at least in the established rows, so these were existing vetiver rows, the soil temperature at 10 centimeters below the surface was a lot cooler than the temperature in either the new and control site. So if we move on to the other slides, I can kind of highlight it a little bit more for you. Right, so these are just the control. So that's no vetiver, new row, young vetiver, established row, older vetiver. And Ronald, if you click on this slide for me. What I kind of just wanted to point out was that it's really the temperature extremes. We do see some differences here. So where there's no vetiver, we always tend to see a lot higher temperatures versus the established rows. And that's, again, very important when we're thinking about establishing, improving the retaining soil moisture, and also, the microbial community and so on. So if you can go on to the next slide. So finally, just to wrap up as well, is that in terms of air temperature, we also noticed that the control sites generally has a lower humidity. So again, that means the moisture in the air is often lower under the control sites where we have no vetiver, versus something like the established sites where we have vetiver. So in other words, from a microclimatological perspective, even from a soil moisture perspective, we are starting to see some of the benefits of the vetiver. So in other words, it's creating conditions that would be a bit more favorable for younger trees to survive. Okay, next slide. All right, so again, just some of the initial conclusions that I would have spoken about. Again, we're continuing to monitor the moisture content, the microclimate and so on this year into the upcoming dry season. And again, I'm hoping that by 2023, we would have a lot more of a robust data set that we can make some really solid conclusions. But just from the initial conclusions, the vetiver is showing that it is having some benefits in this site, and it's really looking as though it's something that would be good as a companion species when we're looking at reforesting degraded land sites. Okay, so I'd just like to hand over to my, I guess our last presenter and colleague, Dr. Gauis Eudoxie, who will be looking at restoring the degraded soil in these quarried systems.
For later on in the day. And I did want to speak a little bit on what we are doing as collation of the entire set of activities that you would have heard of this morning. Noting the first talk spoke to stability as it refers to our ability to adjust water content based on the vetiver root system, coming into the vetiver's functioning, particularly in regards to soil conservation. And lastly, when we think about from an ecosystem restoration perspective, we also want to understand how that vetiver can allow for us to address issues of soil quality, soil health, and soil management. And we do have a trial right in the quarry as well, where we're looking at restoration of degraded soils. Can I just go to the next slide, please? And what I wanted to say here is that what we recognize is that from an overall perspective of understanding that soil is the foundation of restoration, that there are 4 things we wanted to just appreciate. 1, minimizing disturbance. 2, ensuring that soil biodiversity is maximized. 3, ensuring that we have soil cover, and maximize continuous living roots. And when we think about that, what we see from our vetiver system is that it allows for us to have a permanent, even if transitionary, vegetative structure on our soil that minimizes disturbance and allows for the sequestration of carbon and the buildup of carbon. It also, obviously, through that process, encourages our biodiversity and creates as well that organic matter within that first root zone that creates, again, or simulates the development of our soil in terms of what we term as pedogenesis, our overall soil development process. Because one of the things we know about degraded soils is that degraded soils do not have the type of structural integrity that our undisturbed soils possess. So one of the things we want to bring back as the basis of any kind of regeneration is our soil characteristics that are going to support plant species. Like what we're doing at the quarry. So we do have at the quarry an experiment that is looking at, sorry, Ronald, one more. Right, an experiment, a 2-year running experiment that is looking at the combination of organic amendments, whether they are in what we call stable carbon forms such as compost or biochar, or whether they are in a more unstable form, easily degradable forms like brewer's pen grain that we could get from our bear factories or other types of manures, how they interact with the actual vetiver in terms of ensuring that that soil is being regenerated and allowing for improvements in the overall health and quality. And we have seen some very encouraging results. We have seen, for one, and particularly the combination of our stable organic material and vetiver, increase in organic carbon. We have seen as well increased biomass. And I had some slides prior. You could get the presentation, I guess, through our host. But it does show that where you have stable carbon, it does lead to increased overall biomass and overall organic matter content. But irrespective of the nature of the amendment applied together with the vetiver, we are seeing that combination resulting in greater soil health. So I think the takeaway from that is simply that if we want to address the issue of degradation, the vetiver grass allows for a system that as well additive value to adding organic amendments to our soils. So through that, we can see an improvement in the overall soil health, and over time, we anticipate that quality will improve, meaning that it will be more resistant and resilient to destructive elements. So with that, I want to say thank you